hope that we will have a debate. The talk, as this is really the talk, not the lecture, is made in such a way to incite some kind of debate. And I hope that you have read the text by Milner, because this is really going to be a reflection on some points that Milner pointed out. I will read in order to somehow be in time, but I will try to be as entertaining as possible while reading. And I will, for that matter, begin with 3 vignettes, 2 from personal life, 1 from the political life of contemporary Serbia. I guess that you will know something, at least, out of that. So when the first personal, when Me Too movement began to become widespread, but still not widespread in our part of the world as it will become in 2021, I have timidly posted on Facebook the same hashtag on red background. When I was 23, I was confronted with advances by a man I trusted, with whom I had worked on and off for several years, and who was a year older than my father, that is somewhat older than I am now. His advances became outright sexually open and direct when he proposed I worked as his assistant at university, and I rejected both offers without much pomp. I was confused, ashamed, and for years I never admitted it to anybody. It remains to be conjectured, would casual sex have been my entry into teaching or not? We can never know. I never understood, either then or now, that my case was in any way exceptional. Now, the second vignette. A year ago, as a full-fledged feminist mother of an early teenage daughter, herself a feminist too, I was reprimanded by her for not being feminist enough. I came to understand that my kid stopped listening to a band she was particularly keen on, as the drummer of the band was cancelled over a Twitter allegation for rape by his girlfriend. My daughter was feeling angry and righteous, while I was cautious and somewhat suspicious towards the means and ends of the cancel culture. My argument was parental, but also, to my mind, deeply feminist, which she opposed with spite. Now, in the meantime, she changed her mind, but still. I claim that sexuality is an enormously complex field, that bodies are vulnerable, as is their use for the means of procuring joy, but also fulfilling other desires that come to us from elsewhere. That society that lives in us without us knowing or wanting that cannot be simply cancelled. And the third vignette, this year was marked by a row of sexual misbehavior scandals, which at least in the beginning was closely connected to the Serbian film industry. Nisam tražila, I don't know if that is the same, I didn't ask for it, was our local version of Me Too, which I followed and wrote about on various occasions. One of them had to do with a well-known Yugoslav and then Serbian actor who later became the Minister of Culture in 2000s and is still an active politician, who was accused of rape by a younger actress who for years had been living in US. The public sharply divided itself into defenders and accusers. The level of distrust towards the woman was exceptionally high, especially for reasons of the actor's fame and his general status of the Frajer. The actor was rapidly acquitted of charges in a matter of really few months, and is now acting as a puppet, and I would say a ventriloquist, of the reigning regime, which is today, Zdravko and I were talking about Janša's regime, and he said, well, worse than that is Serbia. I think that, being a ventriloquist of such a regime is not a very nice thing to be, which somehow hints also in the direction that he was cleared of charges for certain benefits promised by the powers that be. So what would be my tips for this talk? I offer some kind of experience of the personal exposure to sexual misconduct, a feminist molded suspicion that a society gets to be remade by the short-lived uproars of collectivist revenge at particular representatives of men, and a conviction that societies were and are deeply sexist and on the side of power which is male in kind, even if not exercised by all, or for that matter, many men. With these in mind, I would like to critically examine with you and with Zdravko, whose template for this lecture I became acquainted beforehand, some points about sexualities, bodies, violence, and of necessity, power. I am of a Chaldean here, I would say even generally, but here definitely, as I do not believe that there is a privileged site of power or a privileged or one hierarchy, which is the root cause of all other power hierarchies. Then second, that there is some kind of a grade beyond where there would be no power or where some beneficial power would reside. And three, that we have panoply of resistances here to sexual misconduct, and we can see it in various dimensions. For example, solitary individual resistance, or the form of self-labeling and solidarity and amassing, which Me Too can be interpreted as, in the form of cancel culture, but also juridical, institutional solutions, etc. And we also have, and I think that is important for this talk today, have also a panoply of resistances to resistances. So let me first explain the choice of the title for this talk, which was not necessarily very inventive. To simplify, I would say that there are conservative views on Me Too, and those would raise some or all rape myths, and we will come back to that later on, to show that allegations are false and in service of harming men, individual men or men as some kind of totality. Then there are feminist views with variety of what the feminist means. So we have also a panoply of feminist views, which start from a point that survivors, probably rather than victims, need to be trusted. And you also probably know that Verujem-ti, I trust you, was also one of the hashtags used very much in the previous year, throughout the previous year as a hashtag. And finally, there is a view that I would say Jean-Claude Milner represents, and I would like us to unpack that one. So in order to show what seems spurious with the last type of view, I will examine the underlying assumption that there is something like a philosophy of Me Too, which, although not precisely defined and not at first glance normatively delineated, in fact bothers Milner. To do that, I will focus on certain points in the text which are especially poignant and go beyond the particular case of Me Too. So I would say that all of them, and you will see them shortly, are somehow important for this case, but then are definitely not only in relation to Me Too movement or Me Too philosophy, if there is such a thing. I wish to point out that Jean-Claude Milner is understood here as a representative of a stance that has or can have epistemic authority. And this is why I, in fact, wanted us to focus on that text. We could have focused on various others, but since that one was already within your literature, I thought that that could be interesting to see what also epistemic authority means. My sticking to this text has to do with two reasons. One is a wonderful footnote to which we will return somewhere at the end of this talk, and which in fact comes from Zdravko's text, the template for this, for your whole seminar, I understood. And the other is the curious notion of the philosophy of Me Too, which triggered this meticulous disentangling I wish to offer for a debate. So let us first enumerate the points I will specifically tackle. I will now enumerate and then really go to each one of them later on. First, the Me Too movement has, with unprecedented intensity, publicly and extensively raised the question of coitus, says Milner on page 68. Second, he debates contracts, and I know that you have already debated contract for quite a while. So let us also, for a moment in this talk, see, is it obsolete and laughable, or can we still do something with the notion of contracts or not, and why not if not? Then third, with contracts normally comes consent, and I'm here rhetorical, does no mean yes, and why not? Fourth point is about structural qualities, about strength and weakness. That is here in Milner, on the page 76, evoked in this sentence: in sexual relations, the woman is structurally weaker than the man. Italicized is the man, but the woman could have also been italicized, because throughout the text we generally encounter men and women, like plural men and women, various men and women, but here we have the man and the woman. Fifth point is that women's rights are against human rights. Sixth, that coital inequality is based on penetration. So it seemed that they can function as a kind of a totality in itself, these points. Let us then examine these 6 assumptions, some of which should clearly belong to the so-called philosophy of Me Too, to see what that philosophy may be about. I'm now starting with the first point, and I wish us to see if Me Too is about coitus, in fact. So I think that's very important, because somehow it seems that that is the underlying assumption of the whole notion that there is a philosophy of Me Too. The Me Too movement emerged, as probably all of you know, in early October 2017, so 4 years ago, when allegations of sexual misconduct against Harvey Weinstein were reported by the New York Times and the New Yorker. In the coming weeks and months, the Weinstein story developed, and the number of allegations publicly leveled against him increased exponentially. This was followed by the media reporting on a range of sexual misconduct by other high-profile men. And the snowball effect began when Alyssa Milano, who's also an actor, when she tweeted, and with that tweeted this, and with that tweet produced 55,000 Me Too replies during one night. While the hashtag became trending #1 on Twitter the next morning, in just 45 days, the hashtag became active in 85 countries on Twitter and was posted 85 million times on Facebook, one of which was that from the first vignette that I mentioned, was also mine. So what was exactly meant by Weinstein's sexual misconduct? In reality, a great variety of unwanted behaviors. For example, 2 decades ago, the actress Ashley Judd was invited by Weinstein to the Peninsula Beverly Hills Hotel for what she expected to be a business breakfast meeting. Instead, he had her sent up to his room, where he appeared in a bathrobe and asked if he could give her a massage or she could watch him shower. So no coitus was involved, just a series of repeated rejections that, one after the other, created an increasingly tense atmosphere with no clear end in sight of this obviously non-business meeting. So let us move to our local. I mean, when I say our local, I still assume that you know or have heard of some of the Serbian cases, which are really many. In the 5 prominent cases that have shaken the region, the first involved sexting and inappropriate advances by the mayor of a small town to his secretary. Then the second involved sexual intercourse and sexual advances of the drama teacher, which involved underage girls. The third was about rape. The fourth alleged widespread network of pimping of young women by a well-known political figure in power for the last 25 years, let's say. The fifth, obscene behavior without coitus by an adult man with underage girls. So as we can see, not every time coitus is involved. So these are very different types of sexual misconduct, which involve rape, sexual coercion, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and non-actionable sexual abuse. I was searching for what that exactly refers to, and I found one interesting example, and I will give that one to you. It's collected by the Politico magazine, where 6 former Florida Democratic Party staffers and consultants say that current party chairman, Stephen Bittel, current in 2017, has created an unprofessional workplace environment for women that includes persistent inappropriate comments, leering at young women, and even inviting them on his private jet. The women who chose to be anonymous said that he never inappropriately touched or threatened them, but he made them feel so uneasy that they didn't want to be alone with him due to his body language, suggestive remarks, and even the breast-shaped stress squeeze ball he has been known to keep on his desk. So, what we can see is that, I repeat myself, not all of this is about coitus. One could even argue that even if coitus has been involved, the main target of these actions was not coitus per se. What they pointed to is a form of coercion, a form of hostility, and a form of unwanted attention, which hopefully do not end in rape. That is, coerced, unwanted, and hostile coitus. One may even claim that precisely the unclarity of the term sexual misconduct created so many societal ripples and anxieties. According to, for example, Naomi Macy, a professor at the Georgetown University Law School and co-director of the Georgetown Gender Justice Initiative, these umbrella terms were contributing to the backlash against the movement. Words like, and I quote her, sexual misconduct mean everything from rape to bad sex, she said. People fear that we are making the most basic interactions illegal. And the anxiety is not particularly new. Before the 1970s, there were terms which were well known. Rape was one of them, of course, and sexual assault also appeared as a legal term, which again referred to a kind of a pre-coital relation without the will of all parties involved. But starting in the 1970s, the concept of sexual harassment was introduced, largely by feminists, to refer to other behaviors that were seen or felt as uncomfortable and harmful, and this is very important, particularly in work or organizational settings. So we are here generally not talking about people having sex in whatever kind of environments, but very specific environments, which is important for us to remember because of the Foucauldian part of the story, and that is the power settings. There are for sure many ways to talk about coitus today. Unlike the 70s, when Foucault unpacked us as false Victorians, we talk about coituses in varied and multiple ways, extensively and quite publicly. Me Too was, however, not about coitus, if all things sexual do not fall under the umbrella of coitus this way or the other. Saying that all is about coitus misses the decades of struggles to acknowledge and recognize the issues of power which do not belong to the rubric of sex, but can rapidly turn to be part of the sexual domain. And this is in fact what I wanted to show with this last picture, that none of these categories which are shown here in fact involved sex per se. So they all could have led to rape or unwanted coerced sexual relationship between the parties that did not want it, but none of that is actually sexual relation or a coitus. Now, this leads us to the second assumption, and that is that one of contract. What I wanted with this is to, in fact, make us think if the contract is the best framework for approaching the Me Too movement. Then, since Milner uses Kant to see if the Kant is best contract proponent in this story, and also because he uses Marx, is Marx's reading of contract useful for our understanding of how the sexual contract works? My first claim is that the contract framework is really obsolete, as it assumes that sex can and ought to happen, A, within one marriage only on condition that the spouse is dead, then it can also assume the second marriage. And B, that as a corollary, there can be no rape that is a coerced, unwanted, and hostile coitus in marriage. As we live in a world in which sexual acts do not happen only in marriage, and as even rape within marriage is considered a legal category, even though that's a very new legal invention. In UK, for example, from 1991, in Serbia from 2002. I don't know what is the situation in Slovenia. 76. No, I would go with stereotypes, but I will, but I will stop myself. So it is clear that contract is not the best framework to understand the matters of sexual acts or sexual rights. Something has happened in the realm of sexual norms which turned contract obsolete. However, I want to revisit the idea of the contract for a moment and see why the contract between men and women which condone sexual acts produced fundamental inequality between them. And I wish to point out that that happened not at any time, but at the time when the contract appeared to be a fundamentally equalizing social mechanism, which Marx later debunked as not truly equalizing mechanism. But if we're talking about the end of 18th century, the beginning of 19th century, that was the idea. I will go into that more. I will just draw your attention to a book, which I don't know if it's translated into Slovenian. It is in Serbian. It could be probably found also on net. It's a philosopher, Carol Pateman's book, Sexual Contract, which really starts with Hobbes, goes through all the contract theories and nicely theorizes precisely this idea of this contract, which I call contract between women and men, which condones sexual acts. She calls it simply sexual contract. The assumption is about contract is old and very much legal, focused on the legitimacy of progeny, of property in name and offspring. So a woman is understood to be protected from the advances of all other men by contracting with one particular man, who becomes her sole protector and is bound legally to protect her. For his protection from other potential suitors who might lay claim on woman's sexual persona, he is legally recognized as the one who owns rights to her body and its products. This blunt description is known in the common law as the Institute of Coverture. It does not have a specific name in continental laws, which does not mean that it does not exist in the continental laws, but in Anglo-Saxon common law, it's called coverture. In the 19th century, coverture would get its romanticized halo, which would live deep in the 20th century, even though the institution itself has been dismantled by the end of the 19th century in UK and US. So let us, however, return to the time when contract was gradually displacing the previous social framework, and you know that that framework was the framework of the status, and see how women fared in that process. So one of the most famous English jurists, whose name is William Blackstone, who wrote in his lengthy comments on the laws of England in 1765 that, I quote him, "Our law considers marriage in no other light than as a civil contract." So it's there, it's part of the legal and also not only legal, but some kind of normative tradition which exists in UK for that matter, but also in all other parts of the world where UK managed to send their ships and other forms of influence. Both parties must be able and willing to contract for it not to be null and void. This is the only time in the life of a woman who from then on becomes married, so contracted, when she would act as the contracting party. Namely, in the moment in which she contracts, she loses her legal subjectivity and with it all other contracting powers. And so that does not appear as my imagination. This is what then William Blackstone describes as coverture, where he says, by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. Being one person in law is what I will refer to later as persona ficta, which you probably remember from Hobbes, for example. That is, The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, suspended, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. The woman is said to be covered baron, or under the protection and influence of her husband, her baron, or lord. Then Blackstone goes in various details to explain what is that the woman loses, or in fact, when she becomes suspended in the person of her husband, what then she becomes covered with, so to say. But I will not go into that. Now, in the times when the smallest number of people, let's say nobility, the sovereign, who had the power to represent all others based on their status, were acting as persona ficta. The persona ficta in marriage was not an uncommon one. The sovereign, the aristocrat, the father, and the husband were all certain forms of persona ficta. But the idea of the greatest number, and I guess that Jeremy Bentham comes to mind, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, which is then going to become part of the jurisdiction of England and UK generally in the 19th century with its liberalization. That idea of the greatest number, and by the way, Jeremy Bentham was a very young lawyer at the time when he articulated that idea, struggling, fighting, polemicizing with precisely William Blackstone. So that idea assumed the sovereignty needs to be individualized, that one's interests are unrepresentable by another, and that contract is the mechanism which introduces parity and symmetry between the contractors who represent themselves on equal basis. The institution of coverture lived well in the time when Bentham's political ideas became legal, social, and political reality, and women were simply not recognized as individuals who can or ought to represent themselves, their interests, or for that matter, who had at all have interests of their own. So invoking Marx in order to show the falseness of the idea of the inherent equality of the contract is by all means useful, but I would like to say a posterior one. The contract between women and men, or women and men, condoning sexual relations is in itself productive of fundamental inequality in which a woman loses subjectivity in law and is covered and represented by a man, regardless of the class to which she belonged to, and regardless of the work she might have been doing. Because at whatever the products of her body, be that her salary or children begotten during the marriage, belonged to the husband who was covering his wife. Her lord or baron, to just remember that phrase. When Milner protests, and here is something which I did not put here, and I quote him, that the reference to patriarchy is deemed sufficient to characterize the type of society that allowed Weinstein and others to act as they did, end of quote, supposing that this argument lacks subtlety, vision, or a theoretical background and knowledge of Marx's theory, let us consider this. Although myself, I don't like the notion of patriarchy, I have many troubles with it, but we need to be able to think of the societal frame that allows for the vestiges of the contract that still shapes our social understanding that no one's wife is everyone's woman. Or that without a protection of the contract, which legally nullified women but protected her sexual persona, there is no other way for women to protect themselves from unwanted advances. It is not the false equality of contract that is wrong here. It is the assumption that contract can be invoked to represent parity and symmetry between the contractors, and at the same time have women, half of humanity, as able to enter contract only once, and by doing so, to lose their power to enter in any other kind of contract. Unlike wage laborers and capitalists whose equal power to contract concealed a more profound inequality in power, the contract women made with men was their entry into inequality, which would remain their estate. With coverture, to be a woman is to be potentially, while still unmarried, or really unequal to men. So we must go beyond contracts, and we must try to understand the inequality which remained, even if, or perhaps precisely because, there is no contract of the past that protect those in need of protection today. Patriarchy is certainly one possible explanatory framework, while regardless of the change of the notion of contract, certain contractual powers still remain in place. And that leads us necessarily to the idea of consent. So we are at the third point, and I'm hoping that even though I read, you are not sleeping and you're following me. Where there is no marriage contract to protect the sexual parties from possible harm, where there are only individual men and women who want or do not want to enter the sexual relations, regardless of marriage, there needs to be a certain voucher that sex is willed by all sides. For the longest time, that is until the introduction of rape within marriage, and we heard that that was only 40 to 30, 20 years ago, the main clause of the marriage contract was consent of both parties to sex in all circumstances. Once marriage contract is taken away as the surest voucher of consent, the meaning of consent becomes blurred, and it can in effect lead to the conclusion that in the absence of a document signed by both parties, as Milner says, all types of sexual action, coitus, simple kiss, even a glance, should be considered as attempted rape. So the marriage contract had its scarecrow figure. As women were protected by marriage from sexual advances, as it was believed, and as husbands could never be rapists themselves, the real and only threats were the unknown, wandering, trespassing rapists. I'm now talking about the time when we had the marriage contract in place. Women were, for that reason, expected to behave and dress decently, observing the norms of propriety. Indecent dressing has been understood as a call for rape, and you know that. Why did that woman had this short, very short skirt? That was a call for rape. Even today, we have the same argument. It was so a call for rape, a sign of willingness on the side of a woman, and of lack of protection as well, as it was assumed that no decent husband would allow improper behavior on the part of his wife. So even if we did not have coverture proper, as William Blackstone defined it, we did have a normative framework which lived through the lives of the married couples. And I really think that what I just said is like this common knowledge from movie series or wherever, literature, if this is not something that we live today as much. So these two things, which oftentimes went in hand in hand with women being housewives, additionally protected by being walled in their homes by not working, and this notion of the working woman as some kind of sexually indecent woman was also very much present throughout the 19th century and throughout quite some parts of the 20th as well, normally protected women from raving rapists. In other words, women gave their consent once, together with their I do, and all other potential advances would be, in a decent society, excluded, non-existent. The figure of the rapist here works as a kind of an uncontrollable lurking danger that enhances the fears of the public spaces, streets, backyards, nights, also squares where public women operate. You probably know that old feminists, like somewhere in the midst of 70s, there was this huge campaign, Taking Back the Night. That was one of those second wave feminist campaigns which really speaks about that women can go out in the night and not fear of the rapist. So this understanding relies on the notion that rape is the act of having sex with a woman who does not belong to the perpetrator. And belonging is important as it brings us always back to the idea of the contract of the former times. Now, without such a framework, we are left with a host of problems. For example, I mean, this is not the only series of questions, but for example, can there be a rape, so an unwanted, coerced, and hostile coitus, if the woman belongs to no man? Can there be a rape if woman belongs to a man and is not raped by a ravaging rapist who hunts women down, but by the acquaintance, friend, relative, boss, professor, or the man she belongs to? Can there be a rape if a woman is sexually active and has a wide range of sexual partners? Can we say that a woman consented to rape for other benefits? Consenting to rape. Is that a possibility at all? If we had such a powerful frame, which was not only legal, but strongly normative, since it had power to define the identities of women and men, to really say what a woman is and what a man is, like a protector, provider, the one who goes out, is part of the public, whereas the woman is the mother, the housewife, the one who's walled in the house, in that sense. So normative ideas of what it is to be a man or a woman. Then how are we now to deal with an image of a woman who is no one's, can be sexually active and also enjoying sex, but at the same time not wanting to have sex with certain men, or not wanting it at that precise moment, or not wanting it in order to advance in the sphere of work, or, as we heard, organizational settings? This is the area in which rape myths come to be increasingly frequent and which were also all in place in the aftermath of Me Too. One of them is somehow old. I don't know if you will recognize it, but all the others you will. That, what I say old, that is impossible to rape a resisting, that is unconsenting woman, and that in fact all women who in the end were raped somehow consented to that sex. That men risk being falsely accused of rape because women lie, that some categories of forced sex are not really rape, and that no in fact means yes, and that women are in fact some kind of unreliable teasers. And all of these myths were used and are used in legal matters as well. The late 20th century dating culture, which means meeting without chaperones, I don't know if that happened to anyone here or in our generations. I don't think so, but it was probably part of our parents' generation, maybe, meeting with chaperones. So gradual introduction of effective birth control and a certain desirability of premarital sex. So although with still strongly differing expectation with regard to who expected that. I have had yesterday evening before coming here a talk with my daughter and her boyfriend, and I asked them about this precisely, for example. What is the expectation of a boy? What is the expectation of a girl? And then we came to the notion of consent as well, which I have to say that I was very much surprised that they were operating with the notion of consent being 15 and 17. So obviously many things have changed for better or for worse. I mean, we can discuss about that as well. So all of that introduced a different approach to the idea of mutual willingness. The 1970s, feminism did a lot to dismantle these rape myths and was, like Me Too today, criticized for prudishness, for war against men, and political correctness, even though the term as such did not exist at the time, or was not in use at the time. Now, if we today do not work with an idea that a woman belongs to someone who has sexual rights over her, then we need a different framework in which there will be no need for a signed document for coitus, kiss, or a glance. And I want to stress that this applies to the willed sexual acts and not to the advances by powerful persons to women and men who then exercise their power over them. So everything that we talked about around consent, in fact, meant only a willed sexual contact between two people and not the one that involves Ashley Judd and Harvey Weinstein, for example. We need, I believe, an environment in which sexual rights belong to all parties. For such sexual rights to have any meaning, there needs to be sexual equality as a social norm, regardless of the contract, a marriage contract framework. So that introduces the idea of sexual equality, which I would like us to debate later on. And now I'm jumping on the fourth point, which was, if you remember, the structural traits, or to quote Milner, in sexual relations, the woman is structurally weaker than the man. So how do we get to sexual equality? Presumably by not departing from sexual inequality. Because if we say that something is a structural trait, then we are already operating with a certain kind of inequality. Milner introduces a ticklish subject on the weakness, strength as the structural traits. Although at first it is in his text rather unclear, or at least it was unclear to me, if he stands by that claim or if he only attributes it to the Me Too movement, I wish to argue that Me Too does not necessarily reiterate the notion of hierarchy of strengths. At the very least, the movement struggles against hierarchy being socially condoned, as it still is. In that sense, it fights for sexual and social equalizing of power. That would be my point for the debates about Me Too, and generally about feminism. In a few very unpersuasive lines, Milner wants us to believe that some feminist program, as he calls it, which refers to some feminist theory and or movement from the unspecified past, denied that there is this structural trait, weakness, strength. It rather, says he, attempted to compensate for it by stressing certain female advantages, and only now, since the Me Too movement, the so-called machist argument, as he calls it, that women are simply weak or weaker, becomes reversed. And that is why women's structural weakness legitimates the necessity of specific women's rights. And we will talk about women's rights also in the fifth point. The problem with this argument is twofold. First, women's structural weakness, which was understood either as physical or more commonly as physical but crucially socially legitimated, sanctioned and upheld by a contract which made women suspended and consolidated in the person of another, just to remind you, had been used, so the argument about women's structural weakness had been used as an argument for women's rights, even though not by using the notion of women's right, but only rights, ever since the appearance of what is called feminist or rather suffragist movement in the 19th century. So not only from Me Too movement, but ever since there was an idea to think and talk about the situation of the women's estate, the situation of women. Second, Me Too does not exactly fight for women's rights. That would be my other claim, second claim, as much as it fights against wrongs done to women only because they are women. And to complicate the matter further, and men, it will very quickly turn out, in the case, for example, of Kevin Spacey, or in the case of Avital Ronell, which probably you know because both were very close at hand, where in the first case we had two men, in the second case we had a woman in power and the man who was not in power, so to say. So these wrongs have little to do with the muscularity or somehow otherwise expressed strength or seen strength, but they have all to do with power or assumed power of those who exercise it in relation that need not be sexual at all. Although this may seem as a kind of a rhetorical device, the difference between the two is glaring. When 19th century feminists insisted on their structural lack of power, they indeed lacked all the tools, that means all the rights, which they lacked as women. The women of the 21st century are in full possession of these rights. So we can now enumerate them. I don't know, the right to to be educated, to have adoption over children, right to vote, right to divorce, right to have property over your own body, right to earn the money, and etc. etc. Those were not there in the 19th century, but they are here now. We have those rights. And in that sense, we are equal, men, women, and everything in between. But women of 21st century do lack the power to navigate what bears the name of consent and to appear as sexually equal. Let us be reminded that Me Too was not about coitus. It was about power. It was about environment, which is not sexual, but can easily turn sexual. Remember Ashley Judd. When she entered Weinstein's suit and was required to get herself involved in a mutual massage, she was not entering sexual relations in which her physical strength counted in any substantial way. She believed she was to take part in the business meeting, which then turned into a potential sex scene. The inequality between Judd and Weinstein was not structural if we do not see their positions, that of a powerful Hollywood producer and a young aspiring actress, as structurally unequal. But that structural inequality is, however, inequality in power, in which potential sex would have been used only as a means of power and not as a kind of coital drama, to which we will also very soon come. Not so for Milner. So, as he framed his understanding of Me Too philosophy as the one centered on coitus, and as coitus is equated with inequality, he will easily make an argumentative jump from coitus to rape. Consequentially, argues Milner, every sexual act between a man and a woman is a potential rape. In which he agrees both with extremely radical feminists and the ultra-conservative preachers of sexual morality who invoke sanctity of marriage to erase the potentiality of rape, because rape in marriage is, of course, for them, contradiction in terms. What bothers Milner is, however, not this equation as such, an equation which ultimately precludes any possibility of sexual equality. If we start with this equation, there is no way to, I think, make any advance in our understanding of sexual equality. The fear is that by allowing a link between the sexual misconduct and rape, men of all stripes could be accused for rape. Indeed, as the old contract, the one that I described, does not work anymore to condone the sexual inequality and to proclaim it structural, this might be a possibility if the aim is to build a world of sexual equality, so that there would be some false accusations. If we, on the other hand, wish to stick to structural sexual inequality, although without a marriage contract, we do not opt for sexual equality, but for philosophy which denies parity in power from the very start. This is my third take. Let's say I'm losing count. I'm sorry for this. It doesn't matter how many I have them. We're now at the fifth point, which is that women's rights are against human rights, and now it becomes really tricky. And now I will use more of this because I will quote Milner more often than up to this point. Desiring the, the parity assumes, among other things, taking into account the specific position of women who were legally and normatively framed as being without rights, or more precisely, and if we compare different kinds of deprivations, as being suspended, incorporated, and consolidated into their husbands. I'm repeating this also in order for you to make a comparison with the situations between wage laborers and capitalists, which is very often used as a possible comparison also by Milner. This would perhaps explain, if not justify, insistence on women's rights. The invocation of, now this, what I'm going to do with this point 5 is congested in one in one page. I think it's like 2 paragraphs where all of that has been said. So the invocation of the Declaration of Rights, which Milner calls Declaration of Rights, even though the full name is of Rights of Man and Citizen, but it's somehow useful as well, of 1789, which in its first article claims that l'homme are born and remain free and equal in rights, Milner says cannot be sanctioned by the philosophy of Me Too. This is a very interesting instance of reading of this famous and problematic understanding of the verb to remain. The distinction behind this being born and remain is the one between a natural man, the one born, and the non-natural man, that is the citizen, who despite his non-naturality or non-naturalness, still remains equal to what he was when he was born, and that is free and equal. French Declaration is notoriously not instating the social equality of all natural men. Zdravko, can I please ask you for a glass of water? Sorry. Quite to the contrary, in the very same first article, it instates that social differences are okay between citizens. It says that the social differences can be there for the sake of citizens. That was criticized by various, among others by Marx, of course. Further on, in stating the nation in the Article 3, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, it condones the linking between the birth of the natural man and the birth provided by the nation, which transform naturalness of man into a naturalness of a Frenchman in this instance, regardless of social differences. So the French beggar and the French banker or the French lord can sit at the same table, will never sit at the same table, but could imaginatively sit at the same table as two Frenchmen, being part of the same nation, born as free and equal in their Frenchness and their manness, so to say. I'm insisting on manness because humaneness is at the time still not present as a notion that is relevant. The use of Simone de Beauvoir's claim that one is not born a woman but becomes one presents itself as a very creative way of reading of the important French and generally feminist tradition here. De Beauvoir's idea is that whatever we are when we are born, whatever we are, whatever natural material, we become men and women only under the impact of society, which values us differently on account of being women. And de Beauvoir uses the notion of the other or the sex. You will remember her legendary book, The Second Sex, whereas men are defined as the absolute, the first, the one with regard who the woman is always somehow measured or related, because she's always in a relation with or to a man. Strangely enough, Milner is right. The feminists have fought for women to remain equal, and the path to becoming a woman, wonderfully depicted in de Beauvoir's Second Sex, did little to help in that stride. The struggle to remain equal is indeed describable as a struggle for women's rights, which Milner describes as asking more rights and thus demanding inequality, which is, by the way, one of the very often argument against feminism by all colors of argumentations. This struggle can even be emphasized in the framework of the nation, or rather of the nation state, where we struggle for the specific right of French women or Slovenian women, Serbian women, whatever. So we fight for some kind of national legislation. Milner is, however, concerned with something else, as he purports that no social equalizing would do the thing, since the structural and constant inequality, namely coital, cannot be eradicated or somehow rectified. And this is where we insist on structural traits, this really becomes a problem. With such coital inequality, Milner is yellow, with such coital inequality, one has but two options: to stick to what is there that is the structure, the constancy, or to do what the purported Me Too philosophers are doing, to claim that only women have rights in all matters that involve the sexual relation and especially coitus. And Milner immediately shows that the second option is, in fact, not an option, because the way the notion of human rights the notion of human rights becomes an illusion. There is no space for a fair trial, and it becomes improper to invoke the notion of reasonable doubt. Milner goes even further, claiming that the Me Too philosophers imply that no male, and I italicize this male who all of a sudden appeared in the texts. We had men, then we had the men, and then now we have male. I think that is important also to somehow bear in mind, not just on the level of text, but also on the level of, when we end up with structural equality, then we necessarily also have to think about what happens with nature, and male, female is about nature somehow, or at least is so much part of this sex gender distinction that, it must be somehow also known to Milner, even though he does not deal, or in fact he does. In the end, he criticizes sex and gender and how Me Too is doing that wrongly. So Milner goes even further, claiming that the Me Too philosophers imply that no male can act innocently in coitus, and as a coup de grace, Milner concludes, in other words, men have no rights in the domain of sexual relations. So even if we for a moment concur with the supposition that no man is ever innocent, and we can concur with such supposition because we obviously have there the male, the natural predator, the sexual strongman, etc., all of which somehow must come true from the principal supposition that sexual inequality is simply structural, the question is still how one jumps to the idea that, in other words, men have no sexual rights. Obviously, there is a flaw in such reasoning. If coital inequality is there to stay as a constant, structural, ineradicable trait, and I must add, as a natural presumption, something must be done with it, something which belongs to the social sphere, if that natural is already taken. And that would for sure be one possible way to read and understand Simone de Beauvoir when she says one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So I would say that we cannot come to the in other words here. So there is no in other words here, and no line of reasoning apart from the one in which either all rights belong to men and no rights belong to women, or no rights belong to men and then all rights belong to women, which is, I don't know, unpersuasive to say the least. And now we are finally at the final point. I can also stop here. No? Yeah. So the final point is that coital inequality is based on penetration, and I quote, that's on the page 80, where Milner says, woman is weaker party in coitus because her body is penetrated. I mentioned at the beginning that this footnote 5 made me do this entire talk. In Zdravko's text, which I saw, there is a footnote which says, referring to the notion of patriarchy and if patriarchy has any meaning, and in reference to society, it says, it is far from irrelevant what the conceptual status of the present inequality of sexes is, whether it is rooted in the very fabric of our societies, as it is the case of the proletariat under capitalism, or is it merely a sedimentation of a long history of male domination, which is based on some contingent facts. Milner, for instance, derives the structural contradiction from the fact that in the procreative intercourse, woman is penetrated by men, and then Zdravko says this is probably nonsense. And I would like to say probably it is. If we reject biologization of our arguments, or if we don't resort to natural arguments, We have to remain with this unscientific probability. Sexual equality does not, I believe, demand from us to have a new biological or natural basis, or old for that matter, and then do something with it for equality, as equality takes place in the sphere of the social, so to say, regardless of the biological differences, if we want to stick to them at all. I prefer not to, but Milner does. And by way of Lacan, Milner introduces domination by penetration and goes a step further in order to separate Lacan from Me Too philosophy. At this stage of the text, Me Too philosophy is definitely a term. It has an existence of its own. To the latter, he applies the notion which for him lacks subtlety. Human being is the human body, and the coitus is the relation between two material bodies. That's for him not very subtle, as I said. This whole argument appears unclear. I don't know if you read the text and if you managed to get to that last part where this argument is being introduced. To me, it was really unclear. Coital inequality seems to be finally confirmed by the interpretation of the Lacanian understanding of domination, where one is had by the other by the act of penetrating the body of the first, and where we are right to assume that by the act of penetration of the body, that body is not had in the same way as before penetration. That is Milner's reading of Lacan, which then he uses as kind of a domination by penetration argument. So Lacan gives him ammunition here for the argument in favor of structural domination of men over women, on condition, of course, that men are penetrating women. But then Milner does something entirely else to blur whatever argument he had until that moment, accusing the philosophers of Me Too for reducing the Lacanian human beings to human bodies. He doesn't offer a liberation from this bodily inequality in some social humane way. Quite the contrary, he is content with coital penetrative inequality, but is disparaging the way silly Me Too philosophy falls back on material anatomy, falling back to Freud, and thus forgetting all the good things women's studies did against anatomical determinism. If you are confused, trust me, I was too, because I really did not expect the argument to go in that direction. However, I want just to return to the beginning of this talk. If Milner did not do these kind of things like this one, we could easily put him in the conservative tradition. So as I said, there's conservative, there's feminist, and then there's Milner's view, epistemic authority. We could easily put him there with the conservatives, but then he tries to offer also different kinds of understanding and then blurs them in a very specific way, like with this one. However, let me finish. I'm really there. After a full text of claiming and not refuting the structural coital inequality, which was in the last instance corroborated by the act of penetration, Milner reproaches the philosophers of Me Too for their decision to focus on penetration and coitus. Although Me Too was not only about the actual penetrations, I repeated the last time, but principally about the tentative right to abuse power to obtain sexual services of any kind, Milner, who has already seen the loss of all sexual rights on the part of men, now sees the prohibition of coitus behind the cunning scheme of those philosophizing Me Too movement. If women accuse a man, that is Harvey Weinstein, so a very particular figure, for numerous attempts, some successful, some failed, to exert power over them by forcing them into sexual acts with or without penetration for that matter, how does one draw a conclusion that from there, coitus would become an extreme sexual practice analogous, for example, to bondage? Milner here goes farther than the most radical of all radical feminists and is in fear surpassing the staunchest supporters of male, natural, not to say machist rights. his final conclusion that women's material freedom is conceived as requiring an apartheid, segregating sexually mature males from the rest of the society, sounds dystopic and incredible. I had, in fact, some reference to this idea, and I thought of Lesbian Nation from the end of the 70s, which was like the radicalist of the radical notions, although they understood themselves as being segregated from the male mature men. But this is even more radical, so to say, than the Lesbian Nation idea. So maybe this is a possible outcome for one who is in fact unable to conceive of sexual equality. And I will finish with something completely different. Maybe persons who have such a structural issue with sexual equality, as I really think that Malner has, could benefit from advice on gender and power dynamics, which were offered to Harvey Weinstein once he was accused and accused and accused and accused again by a certain Miss Bloom, who called him an old dinosaur learning new ways. Perhaps we all need a Miss Bloom to tell us, and this is what she told him, learning him new ways, that due to the power difference between a major studio head like him and most others in the industry, whatever his motives, some of his words and behaviors can be perceived as inappropriate, even intimidating. Thank you. Hajde da probam.
Kakšno vprašanje? I'll ask you. Regarding the cannibalistic nature of Christ, I just wanted to ask you your opinion about the cannibalistic doctrine.
In Kant.
In Kant, yeah. What do you think?
Well, I have to say that I'm very much now under the impression of what I read in Zdravko, so I don't want to repeat that. I have to say that I very much liked Kant's solution, although I was liked in the sense of how Kant, who really believed that we have to follow the idea of the categorical imperative and to not ever use other people as means, that in this case, that mean and end can become something else. I like that idea, even also if cannibalism part of the means idea is a necessary part of the mean and the sexual act. But on the other hand, I have a problem with Kant's idea of the contracts for precisely the reason why I introduced William Blackstone and, so to say, this juridical lived life of the contract, where all these idealized philosophical versions of the contract in the end somehow have a life of their own, different than the one which we get from Kant, or for that matter Hegel, or for that matter others like John Stuart Mill, or other philosophers. So yeah, what I don't know if I managed to answer. Is that enough, in fact?
No. Anything else?
Ja bih krenula da pitam na srpskom, ali ne mogu.
Ovo je bilo sjajno, do sada je bilo izvanredno.
Okay. I don't really know if this is a question or more a suggestion to go on into further debate. That leads to a further debate. So we started the talk and we said, okay, Milner is wrong by theory of coitus as the central paradigm of Me Too philosophy. Not everything is coitus. By asserting that it is, he relativizes the domain of sexual harassment and oversees that sexual relations are not about coitus, but about power relations. This is like
a summary.
Yes. He says, okay, I think that Me Too philosophy has the theory of coitus and also the theory of power relations that are somehow interwoven together. In the end, as we have seen, it is about women overpowering men. He's talking about apartheid, segregating sexually mature males from the rest of the society. And then he says it's the idea, it's more inequality that they want to produce. It's the power relations are now on the side of women. So this is what he says in the end. And the thing about now when it comes to theory of the coitus that he ascribes to Me Too movement, I think it's not about his narrative line being blurred, but from the very beginning, he says that it is the structural inequality between men and women is the argument he ascribes to Me Too movement. It is them who all the time claim that women are weaker than men by asserting, by reducing sexual relations to relations between material bodies. And therefore, this leads to a strong form of anatomical determinism. And in this sense, and this is a really strong claim that needs to be refuted, I think, Me Too philosophy is a certain break with feminist movements and women's studies, a degradation, a step back. And behind this argument, what he wants to say, it's about now his positive theory of coitus. He's here using Lacan's argument, or at least implicitly. Well, it is not about sexual relations are not about material relations between two bodies. What they forget is an imaginary representation. So sex separates, does not unite. The fact that you are naked and pressing against the other is an image, an imaginary representation. What is real is then I assume this is behind this. What is real is the pleasure that takes you a long way from the other. So he kind of wants to, expose this imaginary, symbolic dimension that the Me Too somehow oversees in sexual relations or theory of coitus. So I at least I try to, construct the story in this way. But now what I'm interested in, okay, Miller is wrong. We have to disapprove it. We have to answer it. And what is the positive theory? Let's try it together to rethink it. What is the positive theory of sexual relations defined in terms of power relations that Me Too propounds? And maybe is there, or can we talk about also some kind of theory of coitus, maybe based on this, or this is something completely different, but at least to, take it to the end completely seriously as a philosophy, let's put it, a philosophical movement.
I very much liked, first I want to say that I very much liked how you put this reading of Milner's, and I'm now wondering if I read it correctly. If, that's very also interesting how then the text gives itself differently to being read. Also, what is the, so to say, a motivation behind the reading what is the motivation of the reader, what we want to find in a text. I want to say that also with the reference to one thing, and then I will come back to in the end your question. I was several days ago. I was talking with a friend and a colleague who teaches at Durham University in UK, and there was a discussion between us around precisely this point. There was some kind of ticklish subject on the issue of not necessarily Me Too, but the rape invocations and potential inequality of men and women due to that. And she claimed that, by the way, in the course of social theory, so something relatively close to this one, she claimed that in the end, I mean, she said to him, because he said that men are in a way now unequal in nowadays, and she claimed that she stopped him. She said that he cannot invoke such arguments, that that's a false argument, that that's an argument that in a way condones sexism and in that sense is not welcome. And we had a long discussion about that. And from that point of view, I was starting to think about this epistemic authority. Because then in the end, it was said that by UK law, any student can come and say, this is my opinion. And no one can sue you or kick you out of the place because you have an opinion. But then the teacher is supposed to correct the opinion by giving the right quotes. And so to say, to offer a truth, which is going to be a good truth if you also want to have a political stance, as she obviously did have there, that this kind of argument is sexism and is not allowed in the class. And I was thinking, after that conversation, and now with your reading, it invites another thinking about that. How, first, to what extent are we allowed to do that? Of course, a person who sits here gives some kind of things that are to be quoted, or rather offers some kind of truth. On the other hand, to what extent are we allowed to simply say anything is wrong? This is, I think, a very important topic for the discussion after all this that I said, confronted with Molnár in this particular case, but in fact also confronted with large variety of texts that are supporting his view or a certain view this way or the other, or my reading of that view. Because, for example, to me, this idea that you mentioned at the end, that pleasure is somehow absent from the two materiality that are two bodies, and that the Me Too philosophers are missing that.
I assume.
It's a wonderful reading. I would really love to also find that as well. And now to then come back to parts of the answer to your question, because it's the hardest question, of course, is that I think that we very much also involve ourselves with these kind of topics when you say a theory of coitus with a certain political understanding of not necessarily coitus, but then, if we go the direction of inequality, sexual inequality, or wanting sexual equality, also then in coital affairs, that there is certain politics as well, which frames both our readings and our argumentations. And I was thinking, when writing this and when preparing for this, what would be at stake as a kind of sexual equality theory.
Power relation theory of
in coitus.
in connection with sexual harassment.
Well, I I mean, on the one level, it's easy. On the one level, it's easy. Although, of course, in practice and in application, it's never easy. On the level of the political norm, it's easy. It's not simply both men and women have the right to enjoy the sexual act and to define what that enjoyment is, or for that matter, not men and women, but anyone who is involved in a sexual act. That there is also a kind of national or even international framework that is, so to say, supporting that claim of all parties involved in the act is also desirable. Although, as we know, not always easy to put in practice, even to pass as a law and not to put law in the practice. So that would be, I would say, some kind of, foundational move from where to then design or think about sexual equality. But if we start from the positions of sexual inequality, then that is very hard to design.
I just wanted to say that I agree on that.
Yeah, well, somehow that is why I wanted to, we started from contract and consent and ended up with the coital inequality in the end, because it seems to me that both things, although in different ways, return us to the position where inequality was the basic position. And then from then on, I agree, and history of women's struggles also concurs with that notion that from the position of having nothing or having little, you were conquering a wider sphere. But that means that it's still that is still like widening the sphere of shortening the ways of inequalities rather than starting from equality. Again, I'm not sure that I answered, but
Thank you. Any other question? May I just one short one that is, in a sense, the continuation of the previous one. I too read the Milner text in a similar structure, namely that where the problem is defined as not as the power relation, but as the question of coitus, or simply sexual relation. Then another move is, and every move that Milner makes, attributing it to Me Too movement, is probably very, very dubious and not conclusive, imminently and in relation to so-called Me Too philosophy of Me Too. So the first definition is the problem is coitus. Then the second, sex, the coitus is the relation of material bodies. Then this relation is defined by penetration and cannot be equal. Every single step is highly problematic, and he make this very, very smoothly, often without almost no justification. So one only wonders where is the justification, where is the reason for that? And I think that the reason is that the point where he wants to come to, and that is then basic inequality. And if we have this basic inequality, which is eternal, so to say, because it is in some sense natural, there is no contract possible, and then we have this strange idea that, okay, the law must protect the weaker is the woman, and then the final argument, and this is, I would say, in a sense, outrageous. Men have no rights, because all the rights are with the weaker. Where does it come from? Actually, when the law protects someone who is weaker, it doesn't take all the rights from the stronger. So this is nonsense. And one can only ask why someone who is eloquent, who is, has a theoretical background, now my question, because it is not that Milner wouldn't have the counterexamples. He cites one Argento, but there is another one that was quoted by you, and I would say he was perfectly familiar with. And this is the case of Avital Brunel, where a powerful woman sexually or harassed a male student. And so the positions were completely reversed, but they were very much alike on the question of power. And okay, no, that was the description. So I didn't know how it was possible for him. But then, since you made a book on the life of body, political philosophy of Judith Butler. So the question is, and I know that you were in contact with her precisely at the moment where she made a public gesture. Now, not a public gesture, when she wrote a letter in support of Avital Brunel and against the accuser. So, what is this story about? So, we have now a woman, a political theorist, progressist, very much pronounced for equality speaker, and which in private, because it was designed as a private letter with multiple signatures of other prominent persons.
Zizek among others. Like the two of them are the most known subscribers.
In support of one that was a woman that was accused of harassment, sexual or not. So how would you explain this strange mixture of a person, academic person, that publicly is in favor of women's rights and equality, but privately supports those in power?
Well, I would say, as you know from that book, that the core of Judith Butler's philosophy, so it's not just that she was advocating women's rights and equality, but the core of the thought of Judith Butler's from the mid-80s until today, expressed in various ways and through various interlocutors, is about radical equality. So in that sense, we could never expect such a move from someone who is the proponent and who wrote for, 30 years now about equality in this or that way. On the other hand, I mean, what I can tell you, and I said that to Zdravko already, is that once when that situation, I don't know if you're acquainted with what happened with UR. Once that it became clear that in fact that was not a scam and that man was harassed by Avital Brunel, I was meeting Butler at several occasions, and she was very much disturbed by the fact that she was conned into believing or conned into writing, subscribing to that email, to that letter. I didn't know that it was a private. To my knowledge, it was a public letter that was there to somehow wash the face and the morality of Avital Brunel, subscribed by several most important philosophers or world-renowned people. And she was then really doing some kind of washing of herself, a very public one, where in fact it was a very huge, I'm sorry for what I did. I am truly sorry. And it was, it was uttered in conferences, in places where it was not just we sit and talk, but in the places where that was a public statement. And on the one hand, it looked like, well, you're sorry now that after 6 months of debate, when it was unclear who is in fact to be blamed, and it was really a highly warm and unpleasant situation for all the parties involved. But on the other hand, it was also a kind of a public statement where it was clear that that she was also believing into something else. However, I agree with you that the terms used in that letter, whoever wrote it, and then even though, I mean, others could have changed something in that letter, the wording of the letter is precisely the same as it could have been used for any other perpetrator, a regular one, a man over a student, or so in that sense, it's absolutely something which needs to be seen in a bad light. On the other hand, I want to say one thing, as with coital equality or theory of coitus, which we can give both the political, the theoretical, the normative, the legal frame in the end, which is going to halt and to which probably quite many of us would subscribe. Then when that is put on a very individual level, and it can be put with where, I mean, one person can have it tested with various person in different ways. So it's not even that it relies on me and me alone, but it also relies on various partners that I will have sex with in my life. And that applies to then everyone. I think it's also, and especially if there is also some kind of power scheme, which, as we know, can be also sexually attractive. I mean, and that is not excluded from this, in the end, as I said, desirable scheme that I mentioned. But as we know from that, that also applies to in friendships, family relations, where you have to somehow also deal with somebody that is close to you or you want to trust, that they did not trespass, that in the end they did. And I don't know if we could only reduce that. I'm not that close and I cannot give that kind of answer, but we can now generalize the situation, this talk about Butler and Ronell, where it's not just we are bodies and since we are at the same level of power, we shield one another. But it can also be we are friends and I cannot believe that you did that. So I'm in advance, I'm on your side, which then turns to be very bad for all of us and exposes the life of power as such, because what it exposed is a life of power. I agree with you on that.
Thank you. Another question. Now, then I will zpracovali primerný to je izlaganje i nadam se da ćemo se opet vidjeti.
Hvala vam.